Forward with Truth.
Welcome back to Forward with Truth, where we explore culture, theology, and public life from a biblical perspective. I'm your host, Nathan Anderson, and why are so many men disengaging from society, refusing to marry, refusing to lead, refusing even to fight for their own nation? Why has feminism become the unchallenged moral orthodoxy in our culture, so dominant that even some in the church are afraid to question it? And why are so many young men turning not to pastors, but to Peterson, Tate, and even Bronze Age cults to find out the answer about identity and purpose? These aren't just social issues, they're spiritual issues, and they're theological issues, and they're tearing apart the very foundations of family, nation, and the church itself. Today we're joined by theologian and cultural commentator and academic P. Andrew Sandlin, founder of the Centre for Cultural Leadership, to help us understand how we got here and how we begin to rebuild. Thank you very much, Andrew, for coming on.
Well, thank you, Nathan. I appreciate you and your ministry.
Thank you. Well, Andrew, before we dive into today's cultural analysis, I'd love to begin just with a wee bit of your story. What shaped your faith?
Well, I would have to say, as far as how it came about in history, I was born into a devout Christian home. My father was a Baptist pastor and evangelist and conference speaker and missionary to Northern Ireland, in fact. And my mother was converted at a very young age. And I was reared in the faith, baptized at a very young age. And so I think God used my Christian heritage to shape my faith. And of course, beyond that, I've had individuals in my life that have good Christian men and ladies, in fact, that have influenced my thinking. And of course, a lot of reading. As I said in my eulogy that I wrote for my dad, who passed away a couple of years ago, I was actually mentored by about 5,000 books in one man. And the one man was my dad, basically, just a godly, zealous man for the faith. And of course, a lot of reading. So we could go a lot of places, but that basically shaped my faith.
So maybe as we're talking about masculinity, it might be good to start sort of looking at, your dad and some of the being the greatest influence. What can you tell me more about his ministry, faith, and example, and how that impacted you? And as you've mentioned, it is pretty cool from our perspective over here, because he was a pastor and a missionary to Limavady, no less. So maybe tell us more about him, because I think it would be good to have a positive example of biblical masculinity.
Well, Nathan, he was certainly that. My dad was a man's man from the crown of his head to the sole of his feet, and he always stressed masculinity. He trained a lot of young men in the faith. His masculinity was not reflected mostly in weightlifting. He didn't have time for that. He was preaching the gospel and influencing others for the kingdom of God and the authority of the word of God. But he was just truly remarkable, strong man. I mean, strong of character. Look at other men in the eyes, pay your bills, treat women with dignity. I should say treat ladies with dignity. He did not believe that all women were ladies. Stand firmly in a battle. Fight the good fight. Don't give up. Don't start a fight, but never walk away from one. He was not only a man, he was also a man of God. And he stressed that. As I told you, he started a Christian school. He had several Bible institutes he started. And one of the main things that he did was inculcate masculinity in young men. And I might add femininity in young women. There are scores and scores, probably hundreds today in the United States, my age or some younger, some older, who have been shaped by his strong, forceful, dominating masculine characters. So I can really thank God for that as far as teaching me masculinity.
I suppose when we look at today, Andrew, we don't really see that in some ministries. We don't see a men's men. And what do you think it was that drove him to be like that and encourage other men to be like that? What do you think it was?
Well, he wasn't converted till he was 24, but even before that, he lived in a time, sort of the tail end of what is sometimes called the greatest generation. He served in the United States Air Force, newly formed in the Korean conflict. He had a sergeant that he lied about his age to go in. He went in at 17, and he had a sergeant that took him under his wing, taught him what it meant to be a man. And so he knew about manliness. Even at the time, particularly in the 60s with the hippies and so on, he saw an erosion of historic and biblical manliness. And of course, during much of the 20th century, and we can get into this later on the theoretical development of this, but there's radical feminism that, well, first there was a mild form of feminism that later morphed into a radical form of feminism, and then an egalitarianism that influenced culture. He was a great fan of older movies, and he would point out that it's interesting when you see the movies from the 40s and 50s and actors like John Wayne and Coburn and Yul Brynner and others, not necessarily Christians at all, but there is a rugged masculinity to these men. And today, you look at people like Brad Pitt and, well, I don't know many of them, but um, there's there's an obvious difference in their character.
Hmm.
They're not strongly rugged men. So, and by rugged, he didn't mean by that boorish or offensive or lacking manners. He meant very strong of character and forceful. We're lacking that because of the feminist and egalitarian spirit of our age. So, I think because of that, Nathan, that caused him, in godly reaction, to reemphasize and strongly stress manliness. He saw a loss of manliness in culture, but not only in culture, also in the church, which is why he stressed it.
So, as you've said, we certainly your dad and I think ourselves, we've seen that profound cultural shift in terms of sex identity and relationships. And it's funny you mentioned that because yeah, you think of the John Waynes and you think of Homer Simpson and the presentation, of masculinity. And I mean, the thing is, it's deliberate because
Yes,
when you listen to a lot of these people, when you listen to a lot of the people in Disney and media, they know exactly what they're doing in terms of presentation of characters.
that's
And
right.
the whole idea is man is the man today is meant to be stupid, he's meant to be weak, or if not, he's a tyrant. So there's
That's right.
so we've lived through that profound cultural shift. So what do you see as the root issues driving this collapse in sexual and relational norms?
Well, it has deep roots. Of course, all sinful roots go back to Genesis 3, but specifically with this one, I think it probably began, at least theoretically, with the French Revolution and the idea of leveling. I'm not suggesting the French Revolution itself was pro-feminist, but the roots there of the fact that there has to be equality and the subtle and in some cases not so subtle attack against hierarchy. That's where it began, the attack against hierarchy. And of course, if you think about it, the main hierarchy in the universe is the hierarchy of creator and creatures. So the real attack is on God, who is at the top of the hierarchy that he created. But of course, a subordinate but nonetheless vital aspect is the hierarchy in the family and the hierarchy with men and women. Now, I want to make clear the Bible is clear in the book of Genesis that man and woman are equally created in the image of God, are equally valuable. But Scripture's clear that, by the way, can equally be close to God and equally spiritual. But the Bible is quite clear that the woman was created from the man because she was designed to be a help worthy, a suitable, in the older translations, a help meet, a suitable help for the man. And the Bible tells us, Paul tells us in the New Testament, this is part of his justification for the fact that the husband is the head of the wife, not the tyrant of the wife, but nonetheless the head of the wife. So there's a hierarchy. And of course, there are children, which we're not talking about. But as a result of the French Revolution and the radical progression, I should say regression, of that way of thinking, you come into the 19th century with Marxism, which also Marx also was theoretically at least pro-feminist, very egalitarian. And then in the West in the 20th century is when specifically feminism began to take off. There was a strong push for women voting, which some people are strongly opposed to. That's not an issue that I'm opposed to, but I do acknowledge, though, that that was a result largely of a feminist. Some people call it the conservative feminist push, which is not to be which had problems, but it's not to be equated with modern radical egalitarian and ideological feminism. But throughout the 20th century, you see these sort of gradual gains. With them, Nathan, there comes the problem of the gradual fungibility of man and woman, their interchangeability. Like the humorous line in the movie, the gal says, "Anything you can do, I can do better." So it's as though that women can do anything men can do, and they were started in the military, and today it's just abhorrent. The notion that women would be in combat is just barbaric. I'm not saying that there's no place whatsoever for nurses in the military and so on. But women in combat, it's just a barbaric thing. But I mean, even more than that, today there's the notion that gender, which is a word that's been repurposed for evil means, that gender is a social construction that essentially the quote roles, the traditional roles as they're called, are a result of just a way of perceiving things and imposing a traditional view on culture. And of course, we can reimpose egalitarian views on culture, which of course is wrong. That really is an attack on creational norms. Creation itself has the creation is the OS, the operating system, and God has established these creational norms. And this is why this ultimately will fail, because just as you can try to attack and assault the law of gravity, but you won't break it, it'll break you. And the same is true of these sexual creational norms.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think the thing is when it's probably even, I would argue, maybe even more than just creational in the sense it's prime reality itself, because God Himself is the Father, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore the ultimate patriarchy. So when you're reacting against the patriarchy, you're reacting against God. You know, I come back to what
Mm-hmm.
you were saying there about our good friend Rousseau, or maybe not so good friend, as the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but I suppose, what are the consequences then for men today? I'm thinking socially. I'm thinking, men spiritually, and I'm thinking emotionally. What do you think are the consequences?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very thoughtful question, particularly when you said emotionally. I think that the idea itself of masculinity has been re-engineered, and I agree with you. Not just Hollywood is doing this, but this is major elite leftist institutions have a vested interest in re-engineering masculinity. I think the reason for that is that a biblical view and also traditional view, and those two are not always identical. We can get to that later, but generally, the biblical view of masculinity, it sees men as strong leaders and as independent not of God, but what's necessary for the leftist social vision to prevail in a society is a collectivist idea led by a few, comparatively few elites. Well, it's very hard to do that if you have strong, independent men who are pressing back against that. So, what's necessary is to penalize and to re-engineer, penalize men and re-engineer masculinity and redefine masculinity. I was hearing someone recently talking about, and this is true across the board. Someone was talking about a matter so seemingly inconsequential as men's colognes. It's interesting that back when I started as a young man, wearing men, it was very masculine, very vetiver based. Today, it's very sweet. There are most fragrances, from what I have been able to tell, and what this person was saying, are unisex fragrances. This also pertains even more so to clothing. And if somebody says, well, that's not important, but it is, because it's a reflection of what's going on in the culture. So the notion of unisex clothing is the attempt to undermine. You see women that dress like men and men that dress like women. And I don't mean just dressing in drag. I mean, in general, just a sort of feminized, swishing clothing. And that's a reflection. More deeply, of course, is the manners of men. They don't speak forthrightly. They don't speak strongly. They don't speak authoritatively. Generally, they do a lot of whining, and they do a lot of, quote, negotiating. And not that negotiation, according to the Bible, is necessary in some cases, but it seems that almost everything in modern non-masculinity is just sort of everybody getting around and seeing if we could come to a consensus on something. These are just a few of the reflections of this kind of destruction of masculinity. And you're right, in attacking creation, it's attacking reality. But the fact is, reality bites back, and we see today a reaction against this, and a reaction with a vengeance, and a reaction in some cases that's not good, but it's understandable to a degree because of the this attack on creational and biblical masculinity.
It's funny. I I was chatting to a friend of mine about some of this stuff, and you say that men are doing a lot of negotiating and all this stuff, but in some ways, what I've noticed as well is that men do a lot better in the system that we have at the minute if they get on like that. If you look at somebody like Trump, I mean, far from the ideal Christian man, probably a bit more like Samson, I think, in many
Mhm.
respects. But he's a man, and
Right.
and I think that is the big thing that the society can't have about him, because he's uncompromising. He lashes out. He meets force with force, and he wins. And I think that sort of typifies our society at the minute.
Yeah, I think that Trump is a good example of the last vestiges of an older masculinity. In saying that, I am not saying it's identical to biblical masculinity by any means, but he certainly, his manner is a rebuke to this modern egalitarian and ideologically feminist non-masculinity is what it really is today. And I think that's one reason that he is so vilified by leftists. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, I think as well, one of the big problems that I'm seeing as well in terms of men, because I think it's important to maybe look at Bronze Age um, stuff and later, but I think I think it's important to understand why would men be enticed by this? Why would they be interested? And I think, as I've spoken to a lot of young men, particularly younger than me, I think a lot of young men sort of feel that they're an outcast, and it's men with mass, as I said, men who are happy to play the sort of feminized role. They do fairly well within the sort of systems that have been
They
constructed.
do.
But the men that I see that are quite masculine, they relate strongly to masculinity. They are very often pushed out, and they're treated like an outcast. And I think it's understanding that is important, recognizing that, and recognizing how this. how society is not really being helpful to those men at the minute is so important.
Yes, there's no question, particularly in some fields. And sadly, what you have described doesn't only happen in the culture, it happens in many churches, including many evangelical churches. I do think that there are a couple of areas where there's real room for those men, and that is in business and starting businesses. It's remarkable. Thinking about my dear friend David Bonson, who spoke at the conference where I actually met you. He is a warrior, a masculine warrior in the market. However, if young men are not able to start their own businesses, often many businesses that they'll would get involved in would, like you said, marginalize them or even penalize them or eventually fire them. Other businesses, I've just visited a dear friend in Tennessee, and he is a business owner, but his son is in the trades. He's an electrician. And those fields tend to be, as plumbers and electricians and people like that, home builders. There is certainly room, at least much more room for masculinity in fields like that. There's certainly very little room for masculinity in academia, very little room for masculinity in some modern business, if you're not starting your own business, a little room for masculinity in most service jobs. No question about that. So I think you've touched on something that's very important, and it's something that's very much alienated young men, and it's understandable why they've been alienated.
And I think what we're seeing as well is that men are disengaging. Some are even disengaging entirely. You know, we're seeing men not marrying. There a lot of men, if they were asked to defend the nation, they would say no. Certainly, a lot of the men in the UK that I'm talking to, a lot of them are like, no, we wouldn't give our lives for this country as it is. Um, they're not. A lot of them are not leading in a church context. Um, so do you think that this only part of the reason?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think it's a big part of the reason. I think there's a correlate issue here. Let's take the issue of marriage. I was married when I was almost 20 years old. My wife was 21, and we had 5 children in 6 years, and we were ready to get married. Today, marriage is, if anything, being delayed. Well, part of it, and I've talked to young men about this, I will chide them to pursue a godly young woman, and they will say, well, there aren't many out there. Of course, it might be said also that proportionally there aren't many godly young men out there too, but I understand that there are a lot of women who, and this is interesting from the young Christian woman side. Some of them do love the Lord and want to do what's right, and they're not feminists, but because of the lax divorce laws, they feel it necessary at least to get a degree, maybe though they don't want a career, start in a job, because what happens if they get married and their husband just abandons them? Or what happens if there's a divorce? So these are cultural factors that began as a result of the attacks on hierarchy. And now the problem, Nathan, is that these have become cultural norms. So that it would be almost impossible to turn back the clock 50 years now,
Hmm.
simply because the culture we live in is not the same culture at that time. So, and this is a kind of I believe, a profound point. Different cultures create different kinds of people.
Hmm.
The culture we have today tends to create a different kind of man. Now, the young men you're talking about are like a fish out of water, and most people would consider you and me a fish out of water. We are atypical. For one thing, we're Christians, but let's be honest about it. There are a lot of young Christian young men that are feminized. I don't doubt their Christian testimony, but they've never been taught. So, so we become captive to this culture. What did Martin Luther call it? The Babylonian captivity of the church. Well, we have a Babylonian captivity of the culture itself. So those are a couple of factors as far as marriage is concerned. That's driving it. So the only way really to this maybe I'll anticipate a later question. The only way really to reverse these trends is to create a new kind of culture. And I'm not saying that in our present culture you can't have godly masculine young men. You certainly can, and there are. But if you want this to be widespread, then that's why we need a return to a Christian culture, which demands biblical masculinity. That's what I do at CCL, Center for Cultural Leadership. We're trying to create a new culture. So just as culture creates politics, so culture creates masculinity.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing when you say that about how culture creates different people. Um, it's funny when you know that when you talk to the silent generation men, most of them are not with us now, um,
Right.
but there was definitely a different approach, and I think women and
Yes.
men they interacted differently. I I think the UK, Andrew, is way further down the road of feminization and egalitarianism. We've got equality laws, human rights laws, and they've been pushing that
Right.
agenda for a long time. Um, so it's funny that I think one of the problems as well is that in the church context, more specific, I think we'll move maybe into the church. But I think just generally, uh, there is it, men are all instantly demonized, right? So men are to be called, you know, men are instantly aggressors. They're Homer Simpson, or they're
Right.
right. So,
Right.
and the problem is then, uh, whereas if you think of the Simpsons, women are the Lisa Simpsons of the world, or the
Right.
the the hard thinking, you know, intelligent
Yes.
visionary, or they're the Marge Simpson, the sort of beat down wife who's struggling. So those are the two archetypes that are presented as if that.
Yes.
And I think part of the problem is then when it comes down to questioning, female issues like promiscuity, pride, and self worship. It's easy to do that in men, but it's not so easy in this
Yes.
culture to do it in women. So when we look at abortion, the abolitionist message is not it's not welcome because it
Right.
reveals something about what's going on in the culture with women.
Yes. It seems like a lot of the problems in society are laid at the foot of so-called toxic masculinity. And of course, women have to take their own responsibility, stepping outside their uh, biblical calling. There's no question about that. I think in the church there should be preaching virtually, depending on the situation. All churches are different. Equal rebuke to men and women. Women can fail. Women can be too aggressive. Which is not to say women should be mousy. The Proverbs 31 woman was certainly not mousy. She was a strong woman, but she was a submissive wife, a faithful, strong, submissive wife. So yes, that's certainly true. I think you mentioned the stereotypes in The Simpsons, but you'll see that largely in streaming, in major network TV, and in almost all movies, almost all of them. As you pointed out, generally the male characters are either sort of feminized, androgynous pushovers, or on the other hand, they're just unintelligent rubes, or the ones that are strong men are abusive. They're gang leaders or gang members, or they're businessmen who are corrupt, or they're priests who are abusing little boys. So there is no question that there is a deliberate attempt to erode biblical masculinity. In fact, I would say that this in cinema and on TV, these visual cues that have been going on for 30, even 30, longer than that, these have done more than anything else to assault and erode masculinity in our culture. For that reason, I believe and have believed for a long time we need really strong Christians involved in cinema to produce movies and shows. And today it's easier than ever because they can just be put on platforms like YouTube and elsewhere, if they're high quality, to depict men and women and children in a biblical way and do it in a very engaging with an engaging message and let's say a fiction, a very absorbing plot, and not just preach the gospel as it's often said. I think that's necessary to combat this sort of pervasive cinematic culture of egalitarianism.
Yeah, I think it's funny when you watch Lord of the Rings, from the early 2000s. I think actually, you know, what I really appreciated about it was that they tried to stay faithful to the text of Tolkien.
Hmm.
And Tolkien's approach to masculinity and femininity is, in many ways, it's quite biblical. Maybe,
Yes.
maybe Owen's a bit, but in terms of, it's quite a biblical approach and certainly a traditional one, medieval one. But you couldn't. They're talking about redoing Tolkien now again, and I dread to think what horrors they're going to inflict on Tolkien, and because you just wouldn't get a film like that these days from Hollywood. But you'd sort of mentioned something there, and I think this is one of the linchpins. So, what impact has divorce law had on this, do you think?
That's you have just touched on one of the biggest because it's an assault on marriage. We essentially have all over the West no fault divorce. That can't be justified by Scripture one bit. Now, I must say the Bible does permit divorce in certain select specific cases. I can't therefore hold the traditional Roman Catholic view of divorce. I hold the traditional Protestant view of divorce. Unfortunately, we have gone far to the other extreme today.
Mhm.
And we have today, I just hesitate even to mention it, starter marriages. The notion, well, everybody knows you're going to get divorced. So get married, and then maybe 5 years later, you can move on. Like you would buy, you have a starter house, you can have a starter marriage. If there's divorce on the basis of incompatibility, it's just as easy as buying a car and selling a car. It destroys lives. It irreparably, generally harms children, and it's an assault on covenantalism and the sacredness of the covenant. Um, the interesting thing about this is it's often thought to be of benefit to women. And it's thought again, we go back to the notion of toxic masculinity and women need to get away from abusive men. And I do agree that in some specific cases, men are abusive, and the Bible would never warrant that. But in many cases, they simply disagreement. A woman doesn't want to follow the word of God, and therefore, in our culture, she can easily get a divorce. The odd thing about it, and these statistics and reporting on this is very clear that almost in every case, the divorce is much more difficult on the woman than the man, even in spite of the fact that often a woman can take a lot of the wealth and so on. As far as emotionally and so on, it tends to be more harmful. Though, of course, it harms men too. And more than anything, perhaps it harms children. Let me go back again to what I said, Nathan. I do not believe that it's going to be possible to restore biblical masculinity until there is at least an attempt and a successful attempt at the alteration and revision of our divorce laws. So this is a cultural issue. This isn't just sort of an individualized church issue. And this is why, let me put it this way. One reason that there is such egalitarianism and feminization today and demasculinity today is because of very specific calculated cultural changes. And there won't be a revival widespread of biblical masculinity and biblical femininity and biblical children. There will not, it cannot be on a widespread basis unless there's a widespread cultural change.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's funny, Peter Hitchens. I quite like Peter Hitchens. I don't know you do,
Mm-hmm.
but there's he's a wee bit of a Jeremiah in many respects.
Right,
But
right.
but we need them. But Hitchens was once weighed into the whole same-sex marriage debate, and was criticized as he generally is for most of his views.
Mm-hmm.
But he, I think he was very incisive in this sense that he says he felt the debate was lost. He sort of said, I almost regret getting involved in the debate over um, over same-sex marriage because he says I think it was already lost by the time it began, because he says the problem was once you'd already ceded the point of divorce itself, and marriage itself, then same-sex marriage was then an irrelevance because there was no value, intrinsic value in marriage. And I think
Right.
what I find fascinating was I do remember at the time the church speaking up as it should have, rightly, on the issue of same-sex marriage. But there was no attempt in evangelicalism to sort of say at that time, no, look, we maybe it was because there was so much coming at the church that we're like, okay, we've just got to defend at the minute. We can't go on the attack. But there was no attempt to really say, right, let's actually just look at the divorce law itself and let's go back to base principles and say there's a problem here with with marriage and divorce, and the same-sex marriage will be won if we can actually restore a proper cultural position of marriage itself. Um, so I think that leads us on to our next sort of topic, which is evangelicalism, and how did it respond? So how has modern evangelicalism responded to this upheaval in gender, marriage, and sexuality?
Well, I think, and I deal with this topic in one of my books, Creational Worldview. I think the real problem is that evangelicals, think about the name itself, evangelical, evangel, the gospel. They've really tended to emphasize the redemptive side of the Christian faith, but they tend to be very weak on the creational side and creational norms. This is not something that they've emphasized. This doesn't go back 50 years. This goes back 150 or 200 years. So the notion of they simply, for many years, they simply assumed these creational norms because they were, in a general sense, assumed in the wider culture. But when the recreational contraception came along early in the 20th century, and then no-fault divorce, the sexual revolution and no-fault divorce, and homosexualization and homosexual marriage, and then, of course, in the last 10 or 15 years, the trans movement, they were generally ill-equipped to address those things. And that's why you have so many evangelicals capitulating. One of the most prominent Presbyterian PCA churches in San Francisco made actually national headlines when they changed their view. They had to leave the PCA as a result on homosexuality. They were demanding that only if you were going to be a homosexual, yes, you could attend the church, and yes, you could become a member if you were not a practicing homosexual. That, of course, of itself is a problem. But the strange thing is, eventually they said, well, it was causing division in the church. We stand for the gospel, and we don't stand for these sexual norms, as though there's a conflict between the two. But there's not. In fact, unless there are creational sexual norms, there can be no gospel. The gospel has meaning only in the kind of world that God created. Of course, many evangelical churches, that would not be true of them, and yet they have not been especially well equipped because they have stressed what they consider gospel issues, and I believe their view of the gospel is radically truncated in many cases, certainly diminished, and therefore they haven't been able to address it well. It's been a rearguard action, you're right, addressing these things. Another one I have to acknowledge you haven't mentioned, and I haven't mentioned yet, it's remarkable how there is preaching sometimes against adultery, but none against premarital sex.
Mm.
There is the idea that, well, we can't keep young people from sleeping together just as long as when they get married, they make the commitment to that one spouse. Well, that's fornication, and that itself is eroding the bonds of marriage. So divorce and premarital sex and the sexual revolution and recreational contraception and all of these other things have tended to lay the groundwork for homosexuality, and I might add, so-called transgenderism.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's so much that isn't talked about, and whereas Jesus wasn't afraid to, I mean, he wasn't afraid to even go after the thought life, lust.
Yes,
So
yes.
he was starting at the very base principles. So whereas I think evangelicalism's just, if it does speak up, it'll say, about how you can't define a woman. Now, I mean, it's sort of it's sort of good that I am seeing a wee bit more stirring from that. But I think that we have to go further and we have to say, no, this isn't. It's not about defining a woman. It is the whole thing is chaos. This is just
Yes,
utter absurdity. You know. So
yes.
in what ways, I suppose, has the West, the church in the West, and evangelicalism even capitulated to this sort of feminized value system?
Yes, good question. Well, there are a number of ways. I think the most obvious one we think about is the notion that there's controversy in several, even conservative denominations over the ordination of women to become, at least in my view, elders. I believe the church should be led by elders, which is the same thing as what we call pastors. There's even the push, of course, in the Roman Catholic Church for female priests. And though I strongly oppose Roman Catholicism and the on every major on most major points for sure, they're certainly right not to ordain women. Same is true of Eastern Orthodoxy. It's interesting that Protestantism tends to be collapsing, and even evangelicals tend to be collapsing on that issue. Paul's very clear. I read the scholarship of evangelicals who believe that as a result of the development of Revelation and the quote trajectory of the Bible, that women can serve as elders, and it's just not there. One cannot exegetically interpret Paul to be saying that. And I hope I don't have to go the detail in saying that doesn't mean that women do not have many responsibilities in the church and contribute to the church and all of that. I'm simply saying, as far as leadership and rule in the church, men rule, and they rule in the church and rule lovingly and graciously, but firmly and biblically. That's probably the most obvious one. I think also that a lot of the music has largely been demasculinized
Mm.
and feminized. And we see this in a lot of evangelical praise and worship. This actually began about 30, 35 years ago with music that was better than today, much of today's so-called praise and worship. And some of the Maranatha music, some of the music coming out of the charismatic movement, very soft and soothing. Very little that would tend to appeal to a rugged masculinity. But it goes deeper than that. I have to be fair. There is some old music from the Victorian era, Fanny Crosby hymns, and some of those songs back then, where and he talks with me and he walks with me and come to the garden alone. Very sort of, what we would call the romantic era hymns that many Christians say, oh, those are old fashioned and they're good, but many of them are not. They also tended to lay the groundwork in the church for feminism. If you want to look for really strongly masculine hymns, not that all older hymns are good by any means, but pick up an Anglican hymn book from the 17th, 18th century. Of course, almost all the Reformed churches originally didn't sing hymns at all. They sang psalms, and often with a sort of almost like a staccato rhythm that tended to appeal to men. So the we really see the alteration of the music. I think part of this too is in the music is reflected in the fact that music has become is no longer a part of the congregation. It's essentially in
Wow.
many churches, it's sort of the Sunday morning laser light show, and the musical celebrities sing songs that only they can sing well, and that a congregation can't sing. And even if the men could sing along, they wouldn't want to be singing these Jesus is my boyfriend songs, as a lot of them are. I want to say that there are some songs being written today that are very strong and good. I think the Gettys write some good songs, and there are various others, but largely, I would say a large amount of the music today tends to both reflect and contribute to this demasculinization in the church. There's no question about that. And then third, and I could go on, but I won't, but we really tend not to have a masculine pulpit presence.
Mm.
Um, this tended to begin probably within my lifetime, maybe in the 70s, gradually, though. the idea of the pastor getting up in tight jeans and removing the church architecture, by the way, is important, but removing the sound heavier pulpit for these just little stick anorectic looking podiums. The reason that there was what was called a sacred desk at the time, a large desk, is to show the masculinity and particularly the awesomeness, the importance of not the preacher per se, but the act of preaching itself, preaching the word. Every time I'm in a church that has these strong, masculine, sacred desks that one can put his hands on and pound if he has to, I almost always comment about that favorably. Somebody says, well, that's not that important, it's secondary. But it is an answer to the question you asked. That is a reflection of the demasculinization of the church. More important than that, of course, is you tend not to have forthright, dogmatic preaching. I imagine if I played a sermon of my dad in many churches, they would be aghast. Not that it was mean and abusive, but very strong, very authoritative. Thus saith the Lord. That has been gone. You saw that even in Northern Ireland, though I would disagree with him on a number of points. No one could ever accuse Ian Paisley of not being an authoritative preacher in the pulpit. And again, I'm not endorsing everything he said by any means, but he had a strong, manly pulpit presence, and that often is gone today. So those are three things I think that reflect and also I say contribute to the demasculinization, feminization in the church.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, we could talk at length about worship, each one of those, but we don't have time to do that. But it's funny when you think of the Victorian hymns of onward Christian soldiers versus today. It's your breath in our lungs. It
Yes,
doesn't have
yes.
the. I mean, there's so much difference. I think as well. There's something to be said. I think the rich, deep theology, and that was something that was there in the old hymns that just aren't in many of the sort of guitar led, um, I suppose, feminized songs, because very often they're not
Mhm.
written by theologians these days, whereas in the old
They're
days
not.
they
Yeah,
were. And I think that's part of the problem, because whatever you sing, you then become very often. And also there's no place for imprecation, like the Psalms, you know,
that's
like
right.
we had abortion laws brought into our country in 2019, and the other day, 3 weeks ago, decriminalization England, Wales, and
Mm,
assisted dying. You know, it's not really appropriate that Sunday to come in and say, right, let's sing, happy, happy songs. I mean, we needed to sing,
right.
Lord, judge the wicked.
Amen.
Where's the justice? And so I think there was a lack of imprecation, and there should have been mourning as well. And again, those are things that are missing. But I suppose, do you think that some of the problem as well is that some now we're talking about conservative evangel we'll talk more about conservative evangelicals right now rather than just evangelicals, because evangelicalism is such a broad church, and everybody's an evangelical, from the gospel deniers now to uh
Right,
to ourselves, you know but
right.
but so say you're dealing with an evangelical church, a conservative evangelical church. They promote complementarian theology, but do they sometimes lack the muscle to support young families and prioritize that? And and if so, is there a way we can fix that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Several answers, I'm sure. I think one thing that has been lost, and here I'll reflect my deeply reformed convictions, is covenantalism. Part of the feminization is a result of the radical individualism and the individualization in the culture, and it's impacted the church. And in the church, that means that in many ways, the important thing is not the family per se, but the individuals as such within the family. So it's well-meaning in many cases. The conservative evangelical pastor wants to make women stronger and men stronger and children stronger and deal with them directly in that way. And I don't deny there's a place for that. But there's also a place to deal covenantally, that is, with families as families, and to construct a church around caring for families and buttressing families. You would also think that in a society in which the institution that has been most targeted by Satan, incidentally, it's not the church, though the church is definitely under assault. It's the family. We see everywhere. We've mentioned it, a number of examples here in this interview. The family is under blinding, ferocious assault. Well, you would think the place that would buttress the family and would edify the family and would beef up the family would be the Church of Jesus Christ. But often churches don't have the theological resources to do that, particularly conservative evangelical churches, even some professedly reformed churches. I think that's why you see the rise in so-called family integrated churches. Now, can there be an extreme there? Yes. That doesn't recognize the authority of the church? Yes. But I do understand why these have developed, because of the church has not been faithful in supporting the family and strengthening the family unit and godly masculinity and godly femininity and the role of children and teaching young boys, even from a young age, as my dad did me. This is what it's like to be a man. 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, you're going to grow up to be a man. Here's what that looks like. And young girls, you're going to grow up to be a lady, a woman. Here's what that looks like. So there has to be, and I think this is imperative, Nathan, in our culture today, there has to be an intentionality about that. If I roll back the clock when I was young, let's say 50 years ago, the intentionality wasn't quite as necessary because the culture itself at least had the vestiges of these, quote, traditional roles. I'm not suggesting there weren't problems at the time. There certainly were. But it's understandable if a church wasn't particularly intentional about that. But today, it seems to me there's no excuse for that. And I don't think that the church you cannot have a strong church if you have weak families. You just can't. And it's not enough to say, well, we have strong individuals in our church. That is not sufficient. You cannot have a strong church unless you have a strong family. Let's think about, if nothing else, let's think about the fact that God's church is a family, that the Trinity is a family. We're called brothers and sisters, and Jesus Christ is our elder brother, and God is our Father. So this church is itself a family. It's patterned in some ways, not as the creator, but as creatures, patterned after the God himself, the Trinity, as a family. So it's not enough to stress individuals. We have to have strong families, and strong families make a strong church.
That's really helpful. I think we have and I think it's even things like family devotions, family catechizing, men taking the lead,
Yes.
reading to their children every night and the Bible stories. I think that's such an important thing, because if the kid doesn't see it at home, 30 years down the line, they'll not replicate it. Like if from our evangelism perspective, we've got to see these little children are our first focus on our first mission field.
They are. I love what Edmund Morgan said. He was a specialist, unbeliever, but specialist scholar in the American Puritans, not the American, also the British Puritans. There's a great quote when he's this chapter in his book on Puritanism, the Puritan Family. In fact, I think that may have been the title of the book, but he says something so beautiful. He says, in much of Puritanism, every family was its own little church, and the father was the pastor. Now, he wasn't saying, of course, that replaced the local church, but he was saying that the husband and father recognized his role to shepherd the family and to catechize the family and to lead them in prayer and in devotion and the reading of the word and all of these things. And that, of course, has been largely lost today with the Homer Simpson style of how a man is defined, and that's only reinforced in many churches. And I want to add that I believe strongly in the local church, but it's not the local church's job only to catechize. I would say it's primarily the responsibility of the father, and of course, also in her own way, the mother catechizing the children. But as long as we think that we can eliminate family bonds within the context of the church, we will have weak churches, and that's been going on in evangelicalism for decades.
You know, what you said there is very radical to stuff that is happening in our culture here. I think we do a lot of really, really, really good kids programs in churches. Um, but, you know, in some ways, the danger is, and look, we're not here to, I suppose, we're not here to try and attack our brothers and sisters. We're trying to identify problems that we can find solutions. And I think one of the things I do see is that a lot of parents are sort of farming out their kids to the church to
Right.
do the work that God has entrusted to them, and they're missing out on such a blessing. And look, it's great that parents are sending their kids to the church and getting to know other kids, and you know it's good. We run camps, and those are good and beneficial. But I think it has to start at the parental level. You know, you can't
Yeah.
just farm it out to the church. Um, so now, I suppose one thing we've moved from family. It's important also to mention as well at this point, you know, the whole issue of singleness and celibacy. You know,
Yes.
because I don't I don't think it's fair because what will happen is, you know, somebody's maybe widowed or made a widower, or somebody's divorced, or and that's just the reality of our culture today. There's people as well who haven't got married yet. There's people who maybe don't feel called that. So how do we see the whole? You've written about the evangelical singleness celibacy paradigm. So that's a big word, or sorry, a big phrase. So what do you mean by that, and how do we engage properly and respectfully with the issue of celibacy and singleness?
Yes. So we do have a number of evangelical leaders that are advocating that paradigm, and it basically goes like this. Marriage is okay and fine, but if you understand what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, you really should aspire to a higher spirituality, and that is the life of singleness and the celibacy like Paul. I believe that's a bad interpretation of 1 Corinthians 7, which perhaps I'll get to in a minute, but it does strike me as quite suspicious that this would happen at a time when a lot of Christian young people are deciding to delay or never get married. It seems like a lot of backfill. It's sort of a theological and philosophical rationale and justification for a lot of single people that just don't want to get married. So rather than beginning with Paul, who is, of course, inspired by God, I think we should begin where God begins, and that is in Genesis. In Genesis, it's very clear that marriage is a creational norm. Um, it's very clear. Why was the woman created? She wasn't created to be single. She was created to be married. In fact, the man was created to be married. Does this mean there could never be any single Christian adults? Well, of course not. But that is, and we need to say this emphatically, that is the exception to God's rules. And it's a legitimate exception in some cases, but it is the exception, which means that preachers should stand up and consistently say, particularly in our culture, the job of you young men is to work hard to prepare yourself to get married. The job of you young ladies is to work hard and prepare yourself to get married. Now, there is, I joke sometimes, of the 24 and 25-year-old young Christian lady who just hasn't gotten married yet, who will come to the pastor and say, I believe God's called me to a life of singleness. Why? Well, because I haven't been asked for a date. I'm getting to be an old hag and no one's asked me for a date for the last year. That's not what Paul means. He talks about a celibacy and a life given. He's talking about it's a very special calling to very few people. And those around them will know it, and the pastors will know it. It is a unique and special calling. It's special because it's not God's creational norm. God does call some people that way. But I would suggest that today among evangelicalism, he's calling many, many fewer than some people suppose. So in 1 Corinthians 7, I don't have time to go into the exegesis of it, but Paul is giving, and he says quite there, the advice he's giving is for a very unique purpose and a very special historical purpose. And he says that. No scholar everywhere has been able to determine what it is. Nobody knows exactly what it is. What is this difficult time for which Paul is giving this marital advice? We don't know. But Paul very clearly there, he'd say in some cases, God told me to say this. In other cases, he says, I'm just saying this by permission. I'm just giving you my good advice and counsel. That doesn't mean that it's not a part of the inspired, infallible word of God. But we must let the inspired and infallible word of God tell us what is authoritative and normative. It was authoritative and normative for the Corinthian church at the time, that specific chapter, 1 Corinthians 7, and a number of things said in that chapter. So if we need to begin where God begins with creation, and I believe that this and other factors explode this singleness celibacy paradigm as though this were sort of a high calling. I was actually, Nathan, lecturing a few years ago in Cambridge, and there were a number of young Christian adults there, all single. And I could tell from the questions, they were quite proud of themselves for their singleness. And I was teaching along these lines, and I got some real pushback from them. They said, well, Paul says we're supposed to be, no, we can have a higher spirituality if we're single. So our goal is to stay single so we can be closer to God. And if we get married, we can't be as close to God. I said, oh, and they were starting to push. And so I decided to push back, being the very timid man that I am. And I said, oh, yes, I see it now. God creates Adam and creates him in his own image. And then he's alone and he creates this woman in his own image as a help worthy of him. And he says, here's a help worthy for you. But whatever you do, Adam, don't marry her because she will lead you away from me. Well, you see how utterly inane that notion is. Marriage does not lead us away from God. In fact, I believe that there are things that we cannot know about God, unless we're married. And yes, there are unique things that a single person might know about God that married people don't know in very unique cases. But in general, marriage is a good thing because we know more about God, and we certainly know more about Christ, who is the bridegroom, in being married. So I am, as you know, not a fan of that paradigm. And whenever I travel around, I'm always encouraging young people, get married. Prepare, of course, properly married, marry in the faith, and you need to be properly married, but get married.
Yeah, and I think it's finding the person who you're equally yoked with, not just in terms of being a Christian, but genuinely
Yes,
with harmony.
that's right.
But I think that's right, and now I think there are people who it just doesn't work out for them for whatever reason, and because
Yes,
they're single, they don't want to be. Um,
right.
there's people who are, I know who, for instance, they were they were cheated on, and they're
Oh, yes.
them. So uh, there are examples, and I suppose as well, it's to remember that Paul says it is better to marry than to burn. So there's people out there who
Yes,
desire to get married, and those people are
yes,
clearly not called to be. Whereas
right.
I think there is that sort of in evangelical Anglicanism in England, that there is that sort of single for the kingdom agenda, but I'm not sure I'm totally with them either, and I think I agree with you. So there's a rise. So that's the church, but maybe the church hasn't dealt with some of the issues well enough. So we're seeing that there's a rise in men turning to ideologies outside the church for meaning and masculinity. We've seen the Andrew Tates, the Jordan Petersons, and then Bronze Age thinking. Now, I know a lot of Christians in particular who, not so much the other two, but Jordan Peterson seems to be or has resonated with a lot of young men. Um, you know, Tate, to a lesser extent, Bronze Age to a lesser extent, and there's some in the manosphere as well, what's called, who are reaching out to young men. And what is it? What is it? Do you think that those well, say Jordan Peterson and or people in the manosphere are saying to these young men that is not being addressed by the church.
Well, I mean, part of it, in Peterson's case, is he's specifically targeting them with the right kind of character. And I would say in his case, because he's not a Christian, although he does say Christian things from time to time, traditional masculine character and just basic things. Uh, Frankly, it's many of the things he says are not particularly profound. That most young men would have known these things 50 years ago. They would have learned them from a dad, even an unbelieving dad. But he's certainly um, uh, meeting a niche problem, and that's why the many thousands are following him. Less is true of Andrew Tate, of course, and of course more theoretically, it's the Bronze Age mindset. But in Peterson's case, a lot of the advice he gives is fine, and sadly, many of them did not get it from their fathers, and they're not getting it from their church. And that's how to think and personal responsibility and how to treat women and faithfulness at your job. These things that you or I would consider things at least I knew, when I was 15 years old. But many of these young men don't have them. I think, too, many of these young men feel betrayed by their fathers, that their fathers kind of let down, allowed this culture to become what it did. And in many cases, that's true. In some cases, it's not true, but it's certainly understandable. So while I think it's not unbiblical to read and listen to Jordan Peterson, that's not your best source. Your best source is the Bible and a strong Bible believing church and a strong Bible believing pastor. Of course, they're not in every single city, certainly are not in every single smaller town. And that too explains why there's this magnetism toward Peterson and these others.
Yeah, I think it's funny. Some of the stuff that Peterson's saying is in many ways taken from the fatherly advice of the writer of Proverbs to his son.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
I
The
mean,
biblical wisdom. Yeah.
yeah. So I think a lot of his 12 rules I've seen parallels in the book of Proverbs, and I mean, shouldn't be shocked because Proverbs is a lot of it's observational, and he's using observational things too. Um,
Yes.
and wisdom will always and prudence always comes round. So we've talked about Peterson, and I think that's right. He does call men to order and responsibility, but what about Andrew Tate? He's somebody who's maybe a bit more unapologetically crude, dominant, and influential. Why do you think millions of men are being drawn to him?
Yeah, that's while I'm certainly cautious about Peterson, but would give a nuanced endorsement of him. I absolutely cannot do that with Andrew Tate. I think his view of women is nothing short of abhorrent and abominable and anti-biblical. And at times he said things, at least the quotes I've seen, that are virtually blasphemous. I think because he is not only anti-feminist, as he should be, he is not only anti egalitarian, as he should be. Here's the problem, Nathan. He is anti-woman, and you will never get that out of the Bible. Never. In the Word of God, part of the man's responsibility is to love and cherish and protect, if necessary, die for, in the specific case of his wife. And it's the responsibility of men in general to protect women in general. That's not Andrew Tate, whose goal in life seems to be to bed as many women as he can and abuse as many women as he can. I think the fact that this really shows, and this maybe we'll get to the Bronze Age mindset, this shows what happens when young men rightly turn away from the modern neo-pagan egalitarianism and go back to a pre-modern, originally pagan
Hmm.
masculinity. But many of them, even many Christian young men, don't quite understand. Uh, you want traditional masculinity? Well, part of traditional masculinity is dragging women by the hair and having four wives and and having sex with every woman you want and abusing women and throwing them out when they get old. That is traditional masculinity in pagan cultures. So the answer is not to return to tradition. The answer is to return to the biblical tradition, return to the Bible. That tells us what a man is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that because over here there was this random there was a sort of trying to remember the name of it, but there was this craze and men and parents were being warned about kids being influenced online by the manosphere, and the manosphere is a wide selection. There's
Right,
Peterson and some really good stuff from Christians, some dodgy stuff like Tate. But they were trying to say everybody online are going to end up like this kid, and it was a
right.
fictional thing, right? But the interesting thing is, the kid was presented as a white young fella, and an English fella, and yet it's interesting that Tate's majority listeners is white, sorry, or Asian men, right? So
Yes.
from an Islamic perspective, right? So it's obviously, and I don't want to be, we're not going down the race issue here, but
Uh-huh.
but from the cultural perspective, it's interesting that a lot of Islamic men were interested, but yet it was sort of Christian white kids
Yes.
targeted by the left, and I think that's the thing. In some ways, what his message does resonate, and he is, I think, is a Muslim himself, um, or some variant of Islam
Right.
for Western, um, and for a Western market, I suppose. But then we talk about Bronze Age thinking because
Mhm.
I think Tate in terms of it's overblown how influential he is, but Bronze Age thinking, you've done a very interesting talk about that. But they seem to be offering something different to men. What do you think it is they're offering to men? And can you just give us a brief synopsis, and we can direct people to your talk that you did at ReformCon as well?
Yeah, it's the book is was written somewhat anonymously, though we're almost sure we know the author. I believe he's a Polish scholar, Alamari. But whatever, the book essentially, it's a pretty disgusting book, but no one would say that it's an unintelligent book. The author is obviously very intelligent. Alamari wrote his PhD thesis, which will soon be published, on Nietzsche and Plato. Interesting combination there. The book basically says that Western culture in mass is corrupt because of many of the things we're talking about: egalitarianism, feminism, weakness of men, feminized men, and so on. He will acknowledge that part of that is secularism, and on that point, we would agree with that. But he also believes that laying the foundation for this was the Bible and Christianity. And that's where he's dead wrong. Because I think with Nietzsche himself, he looks at the form, Alamari looks at the form of Christianity throughout much of the West and identifies that with biblical Christianity.
Yeah.
And because it's feminized, he says that's the problem, and that laid the groundwork for this modern egalitarianism. He's wrong, of course. But the point of the book, his solution, and this is where you get the Bronze Age, we need to go back to a time when we had pagan masculine ideals. That makes for very strong cultures. That means that they worship the young man, not men in general, by the way. He really has a lot of unkind things to say about middle-aged and older men. It's the young male, particularly the nude young male, who spends a lot of time weightlifting, and he does. I would not recommend you go to his the Bronze Age site, but if you want to see some disgusting discussion and discussing photos, they send photos to one another, almost nude, some of them nude, bodybuilding, which of course is pagan. You see a lot of male pagan nudes. Today, of course, we think about pornography as disgusting, and it is. And we don't think so much about the what we would call ancient pagan pornography, which was, if anything, the male body was lionized much more than the female body. And he's very much into that, very much into evolution. In fact, he believes Darwin did not have the courage of his convictions, which is that not only young males, but young white males should rule the world, and eventually they will rule the world because the other races are weaker and will eventually die out and should be dominated by young white males. He doesn't quite say what happens when these strong young white males get 50. Doesn't say what happens. Apparently, they fall out of favor and they have to raise up a new generation of these youngsters. It's ironic very much, Nathan, because you mentioned Rousseau earlier. Though he would despise Rousseau's egalitarianism, his notion about the valorization of youth is very Rousseauian and Marxian, that we need to get rid of the older generation because their mind is corrupted by Western liberalism and Western freedom and Western liberty and Western egalitarianism, and raise up a young generation with a clean slate. Well, as you know, structurally, that's very Rousseauian. Though Rousseau would have disagreed on the egalitarian side, the notion of valorizing the youth was very Rousseauian. So that's kind of a quick thumbnail sketch, and maybe in your show notes you can put the link, like you said, to that lecture. I also wrote a somewhat long article on it. You could also link to, but the last thing I'll say about this is you say, well, why does anybody care? Well, that book actually, the sales were quite big. It's not quite a bestseller on Amazon. It was very, very high. A number of young men, particularly young men, think about this, that were working at internships at a lot of conservative organizations in the U.S. in 2015, 16, 17, 18, read this book and were heavily influenced by it. It's interesting that some of the young Christian men who have never read Alamari, never read this, nonetheless will use the same terminology, and while not agreeing with him on a number of points, nonetheless seem to be quite influenced. One of them put on a conference recently called Trash World. Well, that's an Alamari nomenclature. He either invented that, he certainly popularized it. So they don't know that, most of them. And some of them have said they've never read the book, but it shows the influence that it's had.
Yeah, it's things like even red pills and that have
Yes, red pilling,
Matrix,
yes.
which was from the Matrix, which was based on Descartes. So these
Yes,
words become part of the uh,
yes.
vernacular, and you don't even know the origin. But but it demonstrates influence. I think what I would say is I've never come across anyone who said to me Bronze Age thinking. I've read that book. But some of the stuff that you described, the whole weightlifting culture. Now again, that can a lot of that can that's not necessarily
Nothing wrong about it, but
no.
when it becomes the center of masculinity, that's what's
Yeah.
dangerous.
Well, this is it, and I think I've seen a lot of guys who, particularly over here, have in the gym culture, are really into sort of neo-paganism. Particularly,
Hmm.
actually, I found over here that those who are interested in Celtic spirituality and Celtic paganism are on the feminist left, pro-abortion, all that. Whereas those who are into the Norse mythology, and they tend to be the more masculine. So
Good,
I think,
good.
but whether directly or indirectly, there is an influence, or certainly fellow travelers with the Bronze Age thinking. So I think it was an important thing to address, and I think, but I think it's one thing as well is that you look at Peterson, you look at Tate, look at the Bronze Age thinking, and one thing to sort of say is that I think there's a generation of men that grew up reading the Gospel Coalition, listening to Gospel Coalition preachers, and they didn't find the answers there.
All right.
And I remember listening to a couple of very prominent Gospel Coalition, and there was a question about men was asked, and one of the men, and this is a scholar who I've read his commentaries, I have a lot of time from, sure, a lot of his views, but he went, yes, men are just young men are just narcissistic, porn addicted, you know, and it was just so dismissive because
Yes.
we shouldn't be dismissive of women who are trying their best to serve God. We shouldn't
Amen.
be dismissive of men who are trying to serve God because
Yeah.
not You can't generalize. Now there are traits in our culture that we can generalize and say, look, this is a problem with women, this is a problem with men, this is a but it was the sort of disparaging way, and I sort of felt at that point that there was these guys didn't understand what they were doing to the next generation. But funnily enough, people
Right.
like Peterson have been the gateway drug in many ways to people coming to faith. I mean, Andrew Tate less so, Bronze Age less so as well. But I'm seeing a lot of young men, and we're seeing this in the UK, a lot of young men who are now being interested in Christianity again, and it's there's a mission field there. But I suppose, and we're coming to an end. But it's this whole issue of tradcon versus biblical con, or a creational con, we should say, because we've there's so many people out there trying to get people back to the 19. We need to go back. Well, everyone wants to go back to 1950 or in the Bronze Age. What you're doing is you're saying we need to go back to perfection, which was in the garden. So creational,
Yes.
the biblical creational response. So you've written powerfully that marriage is communion, community, and cosmology. What do you mean by that?
Marriage is the first one was communion, you said, right?
Communion, community, and
Oh,
cosmology.
yes. Yeah. Well, marriage is communion. I think the point there to understand is Paul's very almost mysterious language of sort of the commingling, not of being itself, but the man becomes one with the woman and she with the man. It's the communion of our life, the sharing. I'm talking about, of course, a husband and a wife now, sharing a life together and sharing their deepest thoughts and needs and weaknesses and strengths. It's a remarkable communion. There almost there almost seems to be, I must say, even a I'm sorry, an ontological element to that when he speaks about the horrors of adultery. You're taking your body and joining it to a harlot, and that becomes one flesh. We don't know exactly what one flesh means, though it clearly is indicated and empowered by the sexual act itself, sexual intercourse, which is a godly and holy thing if it's done according to God's law. But so that's the communion, but marriage is also a community. It's like God Himself is a community. It's a community of two people, and therefore they make decisions together. The husband is the head of the home, but constantly in consultation with his wife, and it also leads to a larger community in almost all cases, which is having children. In fact, I would add another creational element here. Another creational norm is having children. Now, God can withhold children, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you are young and get married, as some are saying today, we're going to get married and enjoy ourselves, and we're going to have a childless marriage. That's a sin against God, and that's a particularly egregious sin because it's a contra-creational sin. So this marriage is a community and creates one. And then I said marriage is a what was the third one?
A cosmology.
Oh yes, well that's where we get right back again to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. Marriage itself is a reflection of God's work in the universe. Now, I think I make the point there that just as what we call the law of gravity is a law of the universe, so marriage is a law of the universe. That's why marriage, despite the fact that it's under assault, it's been redefined. Marriage will never be destroyed. It'll never be undermined. I mean, successfully undermined. There will come a day when people will come back and say, "Oh, we have been insane. What have our forefathers done? We have been mad in thinking that we could somehow rethink this, re-engineer this, and eliminate this." It is God's way that the universe works. It's part of the OS, the operating system of the universe. So this, and I would say this, Nathan, as we're coming to a close, this, by the way, is every bit as important as the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I would say more foundational than the gospel, because the gospel has meaning only in the kind of universe that God created. And
Yes.
he created a universe in which marriage is a norm and a law.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's Jesus himself goes back all the time to Moses. And he says that if you don't believe Moses, how will you believe my words? And he's always back to the creational mindset. And it's that thinking. So I this will be the final question then. So you'll see behind me, I've got a poster and it says the empire needs men. And part of that was just a sort of Victorian masculinity. That's part of the reason that's
Hmm.
there. And but we don't need to go back to 1950s or a Victorian or a medieval or Bronze Age
Right.
masculinity. We need to go back to a masculinity that we see in the garden or the garden of,
Amen.
well, two gardens. The masculinity we
Amen.
see in the Garden of Eden and the masculinity we see in the Garden of Gethsemane. So, how can churches reclaim this creational vision and this Christological vision of masculinity? And what should we be teaching, preaching, and modeling in our biblical creational vision of masculinity and femininity?
Well, I think that first of all, the churches, local churches, the elders, the leaders of the church need to make this a priority. They have to be very intentional about this. Now, I would say that the strong stress on masculinity, it cannot be on masculinity alone. Remember, we talked about the family, so there has to be a strong stress on what it means to be a woman also, and to grow up as a child, a young boy or a young girl. So, but an aspect of that, no question, is on biblical masculinity, and starting where God starts. Look, God wrote a book, 66 books, and he meant it to be read the way that he laid it out. And you start in Genesis. Uh, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 lay out the cosmology, lays out the worldview for everything else that happens.
Yeah.
And then comes the fall of Genesis 3, and of course Genesis 3:15, God's promise to gradually undo the fall definitively with his son, whose death on the cross and resurrection reverses the fall. And in my view, at least, the advancement of the kingdom in history and the final exclamation point when Christ comes, when all evil's done away with, and the curse is completely eradicated. Starting there, rather than with John 3:16 or even Psalm 23, is important. So the church itself must make that commitment. I think the church itself needs to rethink its music program and the songs it sings. Do you have a celebrity thing? Is it a worship team that's most important? And are they leading the congregation? Are you leading the congregation to sing? What about the songs? I would say, elders, if you're listening, do not farm out your set list every Sunday and say, well, we just trust the worship team to do that. No, every song teaches a theology. And if you see a song that comes in recommended by the worship team and says, no, that doesn't, strike it off and say, no, we're not singing that song. We're going to sing this song, and including masculine songs and songs that stress biblical femininity also. Both of them are needed. Um, we also need a church that is very strong theologically. We need a church that has a strong pulpit presence. It doesn't mean every preacher has to be loud. It means there has to be a forcefulness in delivering the word of God. There has to be an attitude of thus saith the Lord in the church of Jesus Christ. If you model that, then you'll tend to have a stronger biblical and masculine church. One of my friends now passed away, but he once said, preach to women and you will get women. Preach to men and you will get men, women, and children. He said, it's
Mm.
always a case of that old movie, Tyler, where the boys are. If you have strong masculine men, women are attracted to strong. And by that, I don't mean Andrew Tate, Bronze Age men. I mean biblically masculine men who are strong, who lead, who are decisive, but who sacrifice, who love, who give themselves up for women to protect them and children at all costs. Women are something God placed in women to be very attracted to that. And that's the way it should be. That's part of the creational order. So those are a few things that I think the church can do. And then, of course, in the wider culture, the church has to influence the culture. I mentioned altering in the cinematography and movies and TV, but other aspects of culture. We need strong leaders in universities and elsewhere. We could go on and on about that, but ultimately, there will not be a cultural remasculinization unless there is a Christian culture, and that's why we need strong men with women beside them, leading working toward a Christian culture.
Yeah. And going to a biblical approach to divorce. It's so important.
Yes,
So important,
yes.
you know. Um, well,
Yep.
look, Andrew, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Really have. It's been very, very helpful on so many uh, issues regarding our sort of culture at the minute, um, particularly in the sort of area of masculinity, femininity, and the family. So, can you tell us how can people follow your ministry? How can they plug into and read some of the stuff that you've taught us, and and more stuff that you've explored?
Thanks so much for giving me that opportunity, Nathan. Yes, you can learn about the Center for Cultural Leadership celebrating this year. It's 25th, or it's a silver anniversary, 25th anniversary. You can go to christianculture.com. That's written, of course, solidly as one word, christianculture.com to learn more. If you want to just sign up for free to get my generally bi-weekly original article on Substack, just go to Substack and type in my name. I think it's called Culture Change also. You can get there. If you want to read my books, just go to my Amazon author page and put my name in there. I don't know, with print and digital, maybe 25 or 30. Maybe start with one Christian culture or I got one on marriage, the family. You can also start. Most of my books are not real large. I write smaller books so you can digest them. And then you want to hear the lectures and sermons and my talks, just iTunes. Just type my name in and you get, not just on iTunes, but the other platforms. Just type my name in and you'll tend to get those. So, and YouTube, my YouTube channel, you can check that out. Just type my name in again. And those are a few of them.
Brilliant. So type your name somewhere and you'll definitely find you.
Yes, I'll be. There are bad things said about me too. I hope none of those are true, but you can find the stuff too.
Well, that's good. Well, you're in good company because they've said a lot of bad things about the Lord, about the apostle,
Amen.
and every follower since. So, but look, Andrew, thank you so much. If you're listening and you care about truth, family, faithful public witness, then have a look at Andrew's material online. But also, please like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, keep advancing Christ's kingdom in every domain and moving forward with truth.